Hi everyone, and welcome to your next key study for your SIL, which is the Stanford prison experiment, and this was conducted by Zimbardo in 1971. My name's Amy and I'm going to be taking you through this short video to explain this key study. We're just going to have a look at some key terms which you'll need to have a good understanding of before we go through the main study. So I'll talk you through these and then we'll get started. So we're looking at this key term which we call social roles. So these are the parts that people play as members of various social groups. And as it says on the slide, these are accompanied by expectations we and others have of what is appropriate behaviour in each role. So for example, you all have lots of different social roles that you have depending on what kind of person you are, depending on whether you have any brothers or sisters, depending if you have a job. So if you think about you as a person, you might be a son or a daughter, you might have a job, you might be a waitress, or you might be a customer service assistant, you might have siblings, so you might be a brother or sister, you might even be an auntie or uncle. So you've got all of these different social roles, and as it says on the slide, that then leads to expectations of how others would see you, or the expectations of how you would behave. So for example, another social role could be that you're a friend. So the behaviour that you show with your friends, or the behaviour that your friends expect you to show, will be different to obviously the behaviour that you may show as when you're in your job. Okay, so you'll have very different behaviour and expectations that others expect of you depending on what role you are playing at that particular time. Okay, so as you can see in the picture on the right, that's just a sort of picture to show you all the different roles that person may have. Okay, so as you can see, her job is a lawyer. So she obviously is going to have very different behaviour to when she's a lawyer than if she is an auntie or a wife, for example. So I've kind of talked you through this already, but for example, someone could have the following roles. So this is obviously a female. So a student, a sister, a waitress, an auntie and a daughter. So they've got different roles and different behaviours which would be appropriate when they're in that particular role. So if you have a job, a part-time job, you can probably think about the difference in how you would behave in your part-time job to how you would behave at home with your siblings, for example. Okay, so there's obviously very different behaviours which society would expect you to have depending on the role that you are playing at that particular time. So when we're thinking about conformity to social roles, this is when an individual adopts a particular behaviour and belief while in a particular social situation. Okay, so we're going to have a look at this conformity to social roles later on when we're going through the Zimbardo study, but the conformities to social roles is going along with social roles while in a particular social situation. So that could be something like if somebody attends a football match and a fight breaks out, they might conform to the social role of others, a bit of hooliganism. They might conform to that social role and change their behaviour when they're within that group. So that's what we're kind of thinking about today. And finally, people learn how to behave in certain situations by observing the social roles of others and then conforming to them. So that's where the sort of the football match would that would kind of fit in really well with that, because somebody might have never really got into a fight at a football match, but then a fight breaks out near them, they're watching what other people are doing and they join in. That would be conforming to that social role. Okay, so we are going to have a look at some of these roles within the prison experiment in a minute, but I just want you to have a think about what expectations would you have in terms of the behaviour for the following social roles. So you've got a prison guard, you've got a prisoner, you've got a mother, and you've got a teacher. Okay, so what kind of behaviours would you expect from those kinds of people within society? Okay, so feel free to pause the video and just spend a minute or two jotting some ideas down and then we'll come back and we'll go through those together. So feel free to pause it now and then press play when you're ready. Okay, so let's have a look at these social roles in a little bit more depth. So we've got a prison guard, okay, so we would expect them in terms of the behaviour of that social role to have authority, okay, we would expect them to be able to control the prisoners, so have an element of authority but also presence within themselves, so they might be authoritative as well. So those are some behaviours that we might associate with a prison guard. A prisoner, obviously there are some behaviours which you would associate with a prisoner that may not be necessarily desirable behaviours, but for a prisoner we would expect them to probably be submissive, so to kind of show respect for the prison guards. We would expect them to follow instructions, we would expect them to be compliant, so again following those rules. There are some undesirable behaviours which we might see from a prisoner, but we would expect them to behave in that way, and that's kind of the social constraints that society would suggest that in terms of that how they should behave. Next we've got a mother, so obviously in terms of the behaviour we would expect from a mother, it would obviously be to be caring, to look out for her children, to probably be organised, to be able to have lots of nurturing sort of qualities towards their children. And then for a teacher, again, the types of behaviours we'd be looking for a teacher would be things like organised, being professional, being caring, showing sort of nurturing qualities as well, but also looking out for her students. So you can see that different people in society have different roles, and that will sort of determine the kinds of behaviours that we would expect them to show. Okay, the second key term that I would like you to have a think about before we go through the study is deindividuation. Okay, so Zimbardo uses the concept of deindividuation to explain your responses. So to explain responses in terms of behaviour that we would expect from people. So as you can see on the slide, it's a psychological state which promotes a change in normal behaviour as a result of a loss of personal identity. So that's really important, it's this change, okay? So you actually change your normal behaviour because you've lost your own personal identity. So this can happen. You might change your behaviour if you put a uniform on. So for example, a policeman, they might actually change their behaviour. They might lose their own sense of identity because they've got this uniform on. Okay, so we'll have a look at some real life examples which you might be able to remember from sort of events in society that have happened. Okay, so the first one is the London riots, which happened in 2011. So I'm not sure if you remember this on telly, but it happened in London, but then there was lots of different riots all over the country in different cities. So looting took place. So as you can see in the top right, people were going around and breaking into shops and stealing things, setting cars on fire, just general sort of rioting behaviour. Quite importantly, as you can see in those pictures, they've got their faces covered up. Again, if we think about the definition of de-individuation, they've obviously lost their own personal identity and they're behaving in a different way. So they're actually in a psychological state which obviously their normal behaviour has changed. Okay, and we often see de-individuation in groups because people, when they feel they're part of a group, they will lose their own sense of identity and they behave in the way that they sort of would within that group. So especially gang behaviour, that's a really good example of de-individuation because people are losing their own sense of identity, they're becoming part of that gang, and then they're changing their behaviour. As we can see from the riots as well, these people wouldn't go and just walk into a shop on their own or smash the window of a shop and steal some trainers and a television on their own, but they've lost their sense of identity within this group and now they've kind of adopted this new social role, let's say, of obviously being looting and being a rioter. Okay, so it's quite easy to lose your sense of identity, especially as you can see when people are covering up their faces, and that's taking their identity away from them. Another example is football hooliganism. So these are just some different examples. There was some quite big riots in Russia in the World Cup as well. So again, you can see that people have covered their faces and they've lost their own sense of identity because they've joined these group of hooligans or football supporters, and they've kind of got themselves wrapped up in that situation. Okay, so again, just referring to that definition, they've changed their normal behaviour because they've lost their own personal identity. Okay, so again, they've kind of conformed to a social role of a hooligan, and they might have gone to that football match and not had never experienced being a hooligan or engaging in that type of behaviour, but they've got wrapped up in that situation, lost their sense of identity, and then obviously their behaviour has significantly changed. Once again, these people wouldn't probably behave like that on an individual basis. So what I would like you to do now is I would like you to write the following 10 questions down. I'm going to show you a YouTube video clip which will play through the video, or you can use the QR code or click on the link to access the video. So there's 10 questions, okay, and I want you to write those down and then press play when you're ready, and I'll get the video up for you to watch.
In 1971, Zimbardo and his colleagues
Sorry, I'm just having a few.
University designed to look at how ordinary men might behave if they rolled guards and prisoners. Their research was groundbreaking at the time, but also raised an enormous number of questions for social psychology. The subject matter, outcomes, and methods are all of continuing interest to contemporary researchers.
Zimbardo carried out his study in the aftermath of World War II, and there was a lot of interest and concern at that time about those events and how the events of the Second World War could have happened. Also at that time then, the aftermath of Vietnam, and again a lot of interest in the atrocities that took place in that event and the murder of many civilians by soldiers in that war. So there was a lot of interest amongst psychologists in how the thing could have happened and how ordinary people could have got drawn into those events.
He was very concerned with the impact of social roles and what they had on the way in which humans behave. And I think he was very concerned with trying to understand the impact of the social context. So I think in terms of his work, he was very much concerned with gearing his research around what happens to people when they take up particular social roles and when they become part of particular social groups.
At the beginning of this study, the prisoners were arrested at their homes by real police officers and were taken off to the local police station. Now, this was not something which they had signed up for, and they were surprised, understandably, by this event, and they asked the police officers what was the relationship between this event and their signing up for a psychology study. And the police officers refused to be drawn into this conversation. So this was a very unsettling way of starting the study. Zimbardo brought them to a mock-up of a prison, which he created in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University. What he did then was to divide his group into prisoners, into guards. The guards had a guard's uniform, and they had sunglasses, and they had a stick, and the prisoners wore loose-fitting smocks and sandals. Now, the prisoners spent 24 hours a day in this mock prison, and the guards came and went doing shifts.
Part of what he was doing was observing what was going to take place in this particular context, and how those roles as either prisoner or guard, how they shaped or sort of changed the way people behaved.
The guards now fell into a job. Some of them liked it, some of them disliked it, but it was a job that they did. They gave commands, and now what happened is the prisoners followed them.
You can give me the blankets and sleep on the bed and mattress, or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day.
They found ways to punish prisoners if they misbehaved.
See if we can count backwards here. Let's try that out. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, that's bad. Hey, I don't want anybody laughing.
It was certainly the case that initially the prisoners did show some signs of disbelief and rebellion about what was happening.
This is unbelievable. They took our clothes. Hands off the door.
But after a fairly short while, they fell into their roles. They became very submissive and dependent, very powerless, and obviously showed signs of stress and anxiety and depression.
Things had gotten so bad that we no longer had a group of prisoners. What we had were individuals believing they were prisoners, struggling for individual survival, no longer caring about their other prisoners or their other fellow students.
Meanwhile, the guards got into their roles, and the level of violence escalated over a period of days. They began to humiliate and degrade the prisoners and find every opportunity to exert their power and influence over the prisoners.
Some of them had prisoners clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands. They now taunt, humiliate, degrade the prisoners in front of each other, and they exert arbitrary control over the prisoners.
This escalation of aggression was so extreme that after a period of 6 days, the experiment had to be brought to a halt before the scheduled time.
I think he showed something that was important at the time, that, and I think it is about that notion that, you know, because it's not about who you are internally that matters. It's about the social context in which you find yourself.
Zimbardo was wanting to move away from the idea that we can explain extreme behaviour by reference to individual personality characteristics, and wanting to move instead towards an explanation which focused on social structural factors as an explanation for behaviour.
It's about the groups to which you belong and how you take on those group identities and then, in a sense, become them. And I think that's what he showed, and I think that was such a radical way of looking at things at that particular time.
Zimbardo's study had a very important impact on methodological debate, and particularly ethical debate in social psychology at the time. This study really pushed at the boundaries of what people felt was acceptable for social psychologists to do with their participants, and indeed some people felt that he had gone way beyond what was acceptable to do in social psychology experiments. There was therefore considerable debate following this study and a few other very famous studies about the ethics of experimentation in social psychology, and a much tighter scrutiny following this of the sorts of studies which people were conducting and the guidelines which they were using.
Professor Zimbardo's experiment, like any piece of social psychological research, can be examined to see how power relations are played out, and to see how knowledge is situated in its historical and cultural context. It can also be analysed by looking at the role of the individual and society or social groups, and to see how people make choices and show agency, or how social structures determine the outcome of events.
Okay, so hopefully you've answered those questions. Do feel free to use the link and pause the video and go back if there's anything that you missed. Okay, so once you have answered those questions, again, spend a little bit more time if you need to. If you want to, press play when you're ready, so pause the video again and press play when you're ready to go through the answers to those questions. Okay, so the answers to task 1. So where did the study take place? It was in the basement of Stanford University. Question 2, what did the study aim to investigate? So it's designed to look at how ordinary men might behave when given the role of guards and prisoners, and I apologise for that typo there, I should say designed. Question 3, what was Zimbardo concerned about for the context of his study? He was concerned about what happens to people when they take up particular social roles and when they become part of particular social groups. Question 4, what happened at the start of the study that the participants hadn't signed up for? So that was referred to, obviously, when they were arrested by the police in their homes and they were taken to the police station. They had given consent to take part in the experiment, but they weren't aware that that was going to happen. The reason why Zimbardo did that was to obviously make the experiment seem more realistic. Number 5, Zimbardo divided his participants into 2 groups, and what were those groups? It was obviously prisoners and guards. What did the guards and prisoners wear? So the guards wore sunglasses and a guard's uniform and a stick, and the prisoners wore loose-fitting smocks and sandals. So they were just kind of loose, big t-shirts with trousers underneath and sandals. So that's quite important there, obviously, in terms of deindividuation, which we referred to at the start of the video, a key term, that the importance of the uniform for the guards and the sunglasses was to kind of take their own identity away from them. The prisoners were given sort of loose-fitting smocks, and they were referred to by a number, so they weren't referred to by their names, again removing that identity from them to see how they conformed to their social roles. So quite importantly there, you've got the 2 social roles, which are the prisoner and the guard. Question 7, describe how the prisoners felt. So the prisoners became submissive, stressed and anxious. So submissive is where you just kind of accept what anyone says to you and you just follow orders, you don't kind of answer back. How did the guards' behaviour change? So the guards became violent, they humiliated and degraded the prisoners to exert their power over the prisoners. So they took on their role and they started to exert their power and authority onto the prisoners. Question 9, the experiment had to be brought to an end after 6 days, and it was actually supposed to run for 2 weeks. So the reason why it had to end was because obviously the guards were sort of humiliating the prisoners, and the prisoners were becoming very distressed. Some of the prisoners were going on hunger strikes, and obviously somebody else actually entered the prison and said that it was becoming too sort of unethical, so it had to be brought to an end after just 6 days. Question 10, what did the research show about groups and how they can influence your behaviour? So it's not about people's individual identities, it's about the groups that people belong to and how they take on those group identities. So you can see very quickly the guards and the prisoners took on the identity of the guard and prisoner, and they lost their own personal identity. Okay, the next task that I would like you to do, so this is the last task, is this is the prison experiment written up, and there's some key information that's within the write-up of the experiment. So I would like you to read through this information. There's 2 slides of information, and then answer the questions on slide 11. Okay, so you've got the aim, you've got a little bit of information about the sample, and then it goes into lots more detail. So again, if you want to pause the video and have a read of the information, and then again I'll go on to the next slide and you can pause that. So if you'd like to pause that now and have a read of it. Okay, and these are the findings of the experiment. So again, if you'd like to pause the video and have a read of the findings, obviously within the findings it does mention about the guards dehumanising the prisoners. So again, that's again leading to their loss of identity. So you can obviously think about that in terms of deindividuation. Being dehumanised is kind of taking away their rights from them and kind of making them do inhumane things that is inhumane. So again, if you'd like to just pause the video, have a read through it, and then when you're ready, press play and you can have a look at the questions that I would like you to answer based on this slide and the previous slide. Okay, so these are the questions that I would like you to answer. So if you want to write them on a piece of paper and then use these 2 previous slides, this slide and this slide, to answer those questions. So the aim of the experiment is obviously, what was Zimbardo setting out to investigate? How many participants took part in the experiment? How did Zimbardo make the experiment realistic? So how did he make it seem like a real prison? What did Zimbardo conclude from the experiment? What does it tell us about conformity to social roles? So did people conform to their social roles? Did they change their behaviour, and did they start to act like a guard or a prisoner? And then the next question, do you think the behaviour seen from the prisoners and guards was realistic? So remember that they had agreed to take part in a prison experiment, so they knew that what was going on. Or do you think they were changing their behaviour? So do you think it was real behaviour, or do you think they were changing their behaviour to kind of please Zimbardo and play up to that particular experiment? And this is something called demand characteristics. So just have a think about that question. And then the last question, do you think the experiment was ethical? So this is thinking about, did any of the participants come to any harm at all? So obviously the experiment did have to stop after 6 days. The prisoners did become very anxious. They went on hunger strikes. And if you think about how the guards were treating them, getting them to kind of clean toilets out and things like that, do you think that's ethical? Do you think that's the right way to treat participants? So have a think about that as well. Okay, so that's the end of this particular experiment. So I hope you've enjoyed the lesson, and we're looking forward to seeing you in September.